Think for just a second about the marvelous things that are going to happen when you master how to remember stories and recite them with skill. Maybe you're a lawyer standing in front of a jury, watching the eyes of the jury members light up when you tell them that one story that reframes everything. Or you're a doctor explaining risk to a scared patient using a simple metaphor instead of a spreadsheet overloaded with statistics no one in poor health is going to understand. Maybe you're a teacher or performer who tells that one story your students or your audience remembers 20 years from now. They're changed forever and endlessly grateful. In every one of these situations, you don't have time to pull out your phone and ask a chatbot, "Hey, give me a good story about risk reframing in a medical context." No, you either have something ready in your head or you don't. And I can tell you from experience, having given a TEDx talk and spent years lecturing as a film studies professor at university, the people who have stories ready on tap look like wizards. And they are. This is Dr. Anthony Metivier beaming to you from the Morpheus room of the Magnetic Memory Method headquarters. And I know a little bit about how story magic works because on top of my film studies career, I worked for a while as a story consultant in film and TV. I read scripts, I helped fix the structure in them, and I tried to make sure the story would actually hold an audience. And out of the 10 projects I worked on, 2 actually made it to the market. And that put me on sets with people like Eddie Furlong, who played young John Connor in Terminator 2, not to mention Dominic Purcell from Prison Break, and the infamously wild director Uwe Boll. Now, what got those projects made wasn't fancy gear. It was stories that stuck in the minds and the memories of executives, investors, actors' mouths, and eventually in the audience's nervous system. And that idea of it getting into the nervous system, Ray Bradbury talks about that, and it's just such a wonderful idea because stories are events. And the good news is this: even though wizards are involved, memorizing stories is not magic, it's method. And what you're about to learn today isn't theory that I read in a book once upon a time. It's what I use professionally to this day. So if you like thinking deeply about learning, memory, and want more information, make sure you're subscribed. And for the love of memory, help everyone around the world keep bumping into me in my Morpheus chair here, because I ain't going to quit until I've convinced everyone in the world to dive into the depth and the glory and the treasure that is human memory. All right, there are really 2 big ways to go about memorizing stories, and both of them help you become the person in the room who gets to shape the narrative. And there's a third little bonus consideration I have for you at the end that's going to take story memory to the next level. But the first main way to memorize stories is verbatim, which means word for word. The second is story DNA. This is when you focus more on the underlying beats and the structure of the story, so you can regenerate it in your own words or close to the plot, close enough. But let's start with verbatim memorization. Then we'll zoom out into story DNA, and then I'll give you this very, very intense technique that'll tie it all together. So verbatim memorization is what you want when the exact language matters. Think about something like a TEDx talk or a conference talk where you have a strict time limit. When I gave my TEDx talk, I needed to land the message inside of a very specific time frame. Going off on tangents was not an option. And anyone who knows me knows that I can do tangents. I love tangents. But I had to treat that script very, very strictly, and it has a story in it. Not a casual anecdote, a very, very important story. And so I memorized that talk in a way that was almost word perfect so that I could deliver it on cue. Now, verbatim is also powerful if you're making legal arguments where the wording has real consequences, and also your story in the legal theater may require certain citation numbers, and you can do that with verbatim memorization. Maybe it's poems or scripture passages where the rhythm and the translation are the whole point. Or maybe you're a student of literature and you're comparing translations. Like this version of the Iliad translated by Emily Wilson, it's so much richer to me because miles away in a memory palace in Vancouver, I can find the lines of another translation, which if memory serves are, "Of Peleus' son Achilles sing, O Muse, the vengeance deep and deadly, whence to Greece unnumbered ills arose." It's a very different way of introducing the Iliad, but here is a different version, and it's wonderful to be able to compare multiple versions, multiple translations in your mind. And the way to memorize story material like that without frying your brain is that first, you don't touch memory techniques at all, not at first. You read the material, and you can do it silently, you can do it out loud, it's up to you. Sometimes I'll do it both out loud and silently, but as you read, you're paying attention to where the text breathes. So take that line from the Iliad, "Of Peleus' son Achilles, sing, O Muse, the vengeance deep and deadly, whence to Greece unnumbered ills arose." I read it to try to find the natural breaks. And by doing this, you're giving your brain a map before you start trying to store anything. Now, the next step, you have choices. You can rote learn, which is just to simply repeat the words over and over and over again, or you can develop a memory palace. And if you're new to this term memory palace, basically it's just a mental walk through a familiar location. It could be your apartment, your office, your favorite cafe, church, bookstore, etc. And each stop on a journey through this location holds an association. So for stories, I've worked on memorizing, either in part or whole, like the part from the Iliad that I memorized. It sometimes has just one memory palace, and there are other pieces that have multiple memory palaces. But let's just pause a little bit on this Iliad example so you get a sense of what's really going on. I was working in an office, and my boss at that time didn't really quite believe all this memory stuff. So I used that office as a memory palace. So she and I had a shared frame of reference, and she just said, the Iliad. So we found it, and I opened it up, and it had those words. And in the coffee room that led out to a hallway, I just started, "Of Peleus' son Achilles." And I saw Brad Pitt kicking a pail. Now, why Brad Pitt? Well, it had already been a little bit dated at that time, but there was a movie called Troy, and Brad Pitt played Achilles, so "Of Peleus' son Achilles." And in that room, he's kicking a pail. "Sing, O Muse, the vengeance deep and deadly." Well, I saw outside of that room the Statue of Liberty. And, "Sing, O Muse." So it's not even a direct sound relationship. It's just this image. And she was digging deep, the vengeance, deep and deadly, and she was tossing the dirt towards what was my office door in that building. And there I saw a character, myself I think I saw, wiping away numbers from the chalkboard on the door. "Whence unnumbered ills arose." So it was very, very simple. Now, obviously, this is a massive learning task. I haven't completed the entirety of the Iliad myself, but if I were going to tackle this, here's what I would do. I would actually have a memory palace just for the names of the characters and the locations. And then I'd have multiple memory palaces for the actual story. And the sentences and the paragraphs, exactly how to calculate them, it's not known in advance, but I would make some kind of calculation and work out in advance the kinds of numbers that I'd have to deal with, but not to be super perfectionist about it, but just to have a general idea and to have as many memory palaces as possible prepared in advance so that I don't have to develop memory palaces while I'm memorizing. I have memorized part of the Bhagavad Gita, a section that's sometimes called Song Celestial, and I made the mistake of developing some of the memory palaces as I went, and it got really, really frustrating. So I just can't recommend making the memory palaces as you go. But it was a great learning experience to make that mistake. And, there's not that many characters in the Bhagavad Gita, so I didn't need a memory palace just for the characters. But if I had gone after the Mahabharata as a whole, then I would definitely make sure I had a memory palace just for the names of the characters. Now, you might be listening to this and be thinking, wow, this is just way too much work. But it actually helps make sure that you don't unnecessarily overload your memory palaces with names that are going to come up over and over and over again. And when I think of the Song Celestial from the Bhagavad Gita, one of the things that I talk about in the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass that I suggest you look at are the parts about the wormholing technique and developing a magnetic SRS, which stands for self-reinforcing system. And so being able to reuse a lot of the material because you've memorized it before saves a lot of time as you go. So keep that in mind, that you can separate out the kinds of information that come up over and over and over again. And that's one of the principles of the magnetic SRS, which helps stimulate wormholing, where previous memory palaces help you in the memory palace that you're using, and you ultimately just kind of automatically connect them. And so you just plop these associations into place, and sometimes you don't have to place associations at all. Now, think about this from the Iliad. Sing, O Muse, the vengeance deep and deadly. Later, when I memorized the opening of King Henry V, which is, oh, for a muse of fire that could ascend the brightest heaven of invention. And it goes on from there. Well, I don't have to have a new muse. I just used the same muse from the Iliad. So it really, really makes sense to work on these little systems that I teach. And then you won't need images for every tiny little word like the, to, and, although sometimes you might use little images just for those words. The point is that if you anchor the bigger keywords, you don't have to reuse them again and again and again. You have this kind of connecting tissue between memory palaces. Now, in order to get it into long-term memory, what you want to do is first layer all these associations, like Brad Pitt kicking a pail in a room, and then it's moving towards the Statue of Liberty. You just close your eyes and you mentally repeat that. And you go through all of the images. And what I like to do after I've closed my eyes and tested it is actually write it out by hand. And basically you're just going through each location in the memory palace, looking at what the images were, the associations were, and then you're writing them out on paper. And this lets you check the original, correct any mistakes you make, because Lord knows I've made a lot of mistakes. And then you just ultimately become very, very bulletproof. And if you really want to go for gold, do it backwards. So when I did my TEDx talk, I actually wrote the speech out backwards. Not every word backward, but the last sentence, the sentence before the last sentence, and then the sentence before that, etc. Now, why do that? Well, because it pushes each sentence into primacy and recency, which is part of beating the forgetting curve. And it's using serial positioning in a very, very smart way. And each part gets a lot more attention. So that's verbatim memorization in a nutshell. Now, let's loosen our grip a little, because in many circumstances, if not a lot of the time, you don't actually need word-for-word recall. If you're telling a joke at a dinner party, or explaining the plot of a movie, or using a parable in a workshop, or perhaps like I did for many years giving film studies lectures, what you need is story DNA, the skeleton, not the exact flesh. Oral storytellers have known this for a long time. So there's a book, if you're interested in memory, that you really should read called Singer of Tales. And in it, Alfred Lord, he studied bards who could perform epic stories for hours. They never memorized every line, however. What they memorized, at least this is according to the book, there's a little bit of controversy about this, but generally I think that it's probably quite correct, that they were memorizing formulas, recurring patterns, and beats or functions that they could recombine on the fly. Now, I just mentioned this word functions, and I'm getting that from a guy named Vladimir Prop, who wrote Morphology of the Folktale. And this might seem like it's getting a little bit into the weeds, but believe me, knowing about these functions has helped me remember stories a lot better, and I know it's going to help you too. So what did Prop do? Well, he looked at Russian folktales, and he showed that wildly different stories often share what he called the same functions. So what are some examples of functions? Well, there's a hero leaving home, and then there's a helper appearing. Maybe a test is set. There's a reward or a punishment that follows the setting of the test. And then there are little scenes where someone receives some sort of special device that helps them. And Prop had this term for that called recite of agent, which I really love. Anyway, what it's like is as if the deep structure of the stories are all made of the same pieces, and on the surface, the appearances change. And if you're not paying attention, you don't really notice these functions because a successful story doesn't really draw attention to its mechanics. But if you know the mechanics, you can still enjoy the story and then pay attention to how the mechanics play out and remember the stories. And so if you're really serious about remembering stories better, I highly recommend spending time with Prop. Or if you want a shortcut version and you have my Read with Momentum program, which I know many of you do, there's a bonus course that came with it and still does come with it called Genre Frameworks. Genre Frameworks is a video version of one of the film studies courses I used to give back when I taught film studies as a professor. And I made a big deal out of teaching Propian functions in very popular movies, some of which you probably know. So check that out if you haven't gone through it. If you want to fly solo, here's how you can get started learning to spot and work with story DNA even without reading Prop or going through Genre Frameworks. Watch a movie and then immediately write down everything you can remember about the beginning. Just focus on the opening situation of the movie. Then list each major turning point. Don't worry if you don't know exactly what counts as a major turning point. Just get used to trying to think about the turns, basically, or sometimes what's called beats. Then focus on describing the climax and then the resolution or how everything comes together at the end. At this point, don't worry about any of the lines that the characters said. Don't worry about the names of the characters, although if you do want to worry about them, you know now that you can have a separate memory palace just for the names of characters. But when you're focusing on these features of the story, you're pulling out the beats. And for jokes, the equivalent might be focusing on the setup, who's involved in the joke, and then the turn, which is that unexpected piece of information. And then often you have a reveal where the punchline flips the meaning. And then what you do is you just take that architecture and you store the pieces in a memory palace. And a simple example with a simple joke that's almost too simple is, why did the cowboy take the hammer to bed? So he could hit the hay. Just to remember something simple like that, you can imagine John Wayne in The Searchers riding a horse with his hammer, maybe on this side of my Morpheus chair. And then on the other side, he has a bale of hay and he's hammering it, right? So John Wayne represents the cowboy and he's on his way to bed, and then you have him pounding a bale of hay with that hammer. This is a very, very simple way to break it down in its architecture and then layer it out in a memory palace. And in some cases, you don't even have to add associative imagery because the story itself gives you the imagery. But I suggest making sure you go deeper. I mean, the key scenes, the turning points. I really don't think I can exaggerate how helpful that architectural analysis was for me when I was giving film studies lectures week after week. I mean, just a classic example is Training Day. I remember it very, very well, watching it and seeing the Propian functions play out, receipt of agent in particular. There's a scene where Denzel manages to get Ethan Hawke's ring off his finger. That's receipt of agent. And then later that reverses. But if I hadn't been paying attention, I wouldn't have even noticed that, and I wouldn't have had anything to remember for my lecture. So it's not just that it helps your memory, but it also helps you pay attention to what's going on. And along those lines, there's a much grittier, more old school way to brand stories into your nervous system. But before we get into that, if you're a writer yourself, really digging into story DNA can be exceptionally powerful. And Flyboy, which is my first memory detective novel, which you may already have, it has at the back a study guide where I talk about the beats and the functions in this, and I reveal exactly how the story is structured, and there's a little tutorial on how to memorize them. But as a creative person, knowing that stuff made this book, which is quite thick, fairly fast to write. 44 days in total for the first draft. Of course, there was a year of editing, but the speed of writing it is because I had this structure memorized, and I simply had to have my characters follow it, like the ancient roller coaster ride that the traditional hero's journey is. Now, the sequel, Vitamin X, is a little different in the sense that it really messes with that traditional narrative structure to make a point about memory and to teach you something about memory, but not without making sure that there's a receipt of agent. And the receipt of agent is really, really interesting in this book, and it helps you understand how to use memory techniques, but it also helps keep the story feeling real. So anyway, if you don't already have Flyboy and you want to be notified when Vitamin X goes live so you can learn the various memory techniques in both of these books, there's a link in the description where you can get involved with the memory detective world with a bang, literally a bang, an infinity of bangs, because in addition to being a crime story, it has a lot to do with the theme of infinity. All right, now let's talk about this nitty-gritty technique I wanted to share with you. It's about handwriting, but not just any kind of handwriting. Long before AI, direct response copywriters were trying to solve a similar problem, which is, how do I get someone else's brilliant writing chops into my own nervous system so I can write at speed but have it be very, very high quality and get results for my clients? Now, unlike AI, they couldn't just scan something, but Gary Halbert, one of the greatest copywriters who ever lived, had a very simple answer. Copy out by hand the best sales letter you can find. Rewrite the entire thing again and again and again. And Halbert called this neurological imprinting. You're not just reading the words, you're tracing them with your eyes and your mind and your body all at the same time, meaning that it gets deeper and deeper into your system, your memory, but also the grooves of how your body operates. Now, we can take this principle one step further. Kenneth Goldsmith, he's a poet who is behind the uncreative writing course at Penn. He had his students do something similar, but from a different angle. He'd have the students choose to copy an existing text and then write about why they chose that text and what the process did to their thinking. If you haven't seen Kenneth Goldsmith talk about this in a presentation that he gave at the White House, it's worth it just to see the shock on the faces of the attendees when they're basically told by this guy in a weird pink suit that he teaches people how to plagiarize. The point is not theft, though. It's an exercise that exposes something about the nature of originality while focusing your attention and building your physical memory muscles, but also experiencing story as something physical. Now, I love these examples because long before I heard of either Halbert or Goldsmith, I'd stumbled across a similar strategy. I'd read somewhere that one way to learn writing as a craft was to literally copy out the work of writers you admired. So I remember being quite young and sitting down with Albert Camus' The Stranger, and I copied about 14 pages of it longhand. And somewhere around page 10, something very strange happened. My hand started to anticipate the rhythm. I could feel how the sentences were turning, and the writing bug lodged itself deeper into my system. Now, what does this have to do with memorizing stories? Well, it has a lot to do with it. So let me give you the goods in the form of an exercise. Pick a story you want to remember, Or maybe it's a joke you always forget halfway through, or a parable that you want to use in your coaching or your teaching, or it's a passage from a speech that you're preparing, and then copy it out by hand, no typing, just pen and paper. And while you're copying, notice where the material slows down, where the tension rises, where the natural breaks are, how different characters enter and exit scenes. And after you're finished copying, close the book and then try to reproduce it again from memory. Then, if you're happy with your reproduction, take those beats out and place them in a memory palace like we discussed before. You can do it either just with the story DNA, or you can do it verbatim. And then finally use this principle of repeating the information by walking through your memory palaces. You can tell the story out loud, or you can just write it out again from memory, but this time do it with the assistance of the memory palace. It's very, very, very powerful and important. What you're doing is you're essentially stacking this idea of neurological imprinting, and you're doing this uncreative copying that actually winds up making you more creative with classic memory palace work. Do all that, and the stories you want to remember are not going anywhere. And ultimately use the stories. Tell the stories you work on remembering to other people, even if it's just snippets, even if it's just little lines here and there. Drop them into emails, talks, conversations. Notice how they land. Notice how your own delivery of them either falls flat or gets a great reaction, and then refine. Really, really pay attention to the rhythm, the flow, how you feel when you deliver the text in various formats, and then deliver it in different ways. I know today that I've been quite fast with the quotes that I've given, but I play around with this when I'm getting it into long-term memory. Not just, I'll play his son Achilles, sing, O Muse, but of Peleus' son Achilles, sing, O Muse, the vengeance deep and deadly whence to Greece unnumbered ills arose. And then you could do it, the comedy version, and so forth. And if you do this kind of practice consistently, you'll end up with an arsenal of stories that you're able to produce in a variety of ways and be quite comfortable with doing it in a variety of ways, whatever it is. That will help in the courtroom. It will help if you're a doctor in the clinic. It will help if you're a teacher. It will help if you're a podcaster. It will help being more amusing at the dinner table or at the writing desk when you're ready to compose stories of your own. Yes, AI can generate endless text, but AI so far can't walk into a room and be you with your lived stories, the stories that you've lived because you've memorized them, with your timing, your relationships to all kinds of information, your humor, your feeling for the text that you chose to deeply imbibe. And that's your advantage. Speaking of advantages, if you want more advantages on top of digging into that bonus chapter at the end of Flyboy and getting involved in the memory detective world, I suggest watching my Memory Palace walkthrough video next. In this detailed tutorial, I take you inside of one of my actual homes that I lived in, and I recite for you one of the most difficult to memorize stories I've ever worked with, and I show you the exact Memory Palace I used and the exact locations and magnetic associations with it, exactly where I placed them. You'll know what I'm talking about when you hear me say the words awkward grammar, appalls a craftsman, a data bard, as daft as the raw, damn stagnant art, and scrawls an alpha. Oh man, was that ever challenging to memorize, but also very, very fun and easy because of the directness of the Memory Palace technique. So the link is on the screen and in the description for that Memory Palace walkthrough. And with thanks, as always, I urge you to get out there, memorize some stories, and as always, keep yourself magnetic.